Hey everybody, welcome to the video. So we're lineup building for week 13 of the NFL season over on Draftkings, more so focusing on cash game roster construction. Now, a couple things before I start this video. Number one, the purpose of this is not for me to build your guys' lineups to use in all of your contests. You have to be able to think for yourselves and build your own lineups. I'm just showing a cash game roster construction process where I'm trying to identify guys that are going to see plenty of volume, have decently safe floors, or in good matchups like their price tags and things of that nature. And you can apply that to your own favorite plays this week as well. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. We might hit 7,000 subscribers this weekend, and if we do, I want to give an advance thank you very much. I really do appreciate all the support on the channel. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And without further ado, I think we can get right into today's video. Alright, a lot of you probably know I'm about to say here, but if you've been watching my videos for quite some time, you know I typically like to start with the running back position in cash games, because those are like the key pieces to our lineup. They're not really that interchangeable for the most part. Yeah, there's like a handful of running backs I like to use in cash games every week, but that list is pretty small. Now, when it comes to wide receivers, tight ends, defenses, even quarterbacks, that list gets a little bit longer, and they're a bit interchangeable when it comes to the end of our lineup, just playing around, making things fit. But running backs, those are the guys who are going to touch the ball the most. At least that's the plan. And for the most part, I want to make sure it's the guys that I 100% want in my lineup. So that's the plan here. I'm going to start with the running back position. Now, I'm planning on doing two different builds in this video. I want to spend top dollar for a running back, and we'll see what that build looks like. And then I want to spend top dollar for a wide receiver, and then we'll go cheaper at the running back position. We'll see what that looks like, and we can compare them. And maybe we'll try to do a third one and just play around with that as well. But let's start with the top dollar running back build. Now, there's a nice handful of running backs to use in cash games this week, and I actually kind of like the running backs this week. I know last week it was not my favorite running back slate, but there's a lot of good options on this one, in my opinion. So if you want to spend top dollar, we obviously have Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry. Both guys are in fantastic spots. Now, if I had to choose one, it's going to be Dalvin Cook, and you're going to see that in a little bit. He's going to be the guy we're going to build around in this build. But both guys are in fantastic spots. The only problem with them is that they're super expensive, and the next tier is in the $7,000 range. So if you want to pay up for these guys, you're definitely going to have to find some value elsewhere. But there's plenty of value on this slate, and there's plenty of value running backs as well. So if you're spending top dollar, I'm liking Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry up top. I think that's pretty obvious. If you want to go more so mid-range, we have James Robinson and Austin Eckler. Both guys are in pretty good spots, and I know Eckler doesn't have a huge sample size this season, but he's coming off a 16-target game with Justin Herbert. In the games he's played this season, he got hurt versus Tampa Bay, but 23 points versus Buffalo, then 31 versus Carolina, and 18 versus Kansas City. And obviously, week one, that was Tyrod Taylor. But the guy should see close to double-digit targets in this game. He's kind of like Alvin Kamara, where he's a huge threat in the passing game. He's good on the ground as well. So I definitely have a lot of interest in Austin Eckler. And if we can make him fit in one of these lineups later on, I would definitely be pretty happy about that. It's also a good matchup versus New England. They're 28th DVA versus the run, and they're also playing at home, so I'm not really too scared of New England's defense, and he would definitely be a fantastic option. James Robinson's the other running back in the mid-range who I think should be an excellent play this week. I know they're 10-point dogs on the road versus Minnesota, and I know the Jaguars' offense isn't exactly anything anyone's too happy to play, but James Robinson's been so consistent this season, and they were dogs on the road in Cleveland, and he balled out. Over 20 rushing attempts, had over 120 rushing yards, got into the end zone, also had 6 targets for 31 yards, had nearly 30 fantasy points, one of the best games he's had all season long. And he really hasn't had a bad game this year. I know he's had a couple of 10, 11-point games, but that's his absolute floor this season. He should see around 20 touches, if not more. He's going to be involved in the passing game. So James Robinson's obviously an elite option this week as well. And if you're not spending top dollar for a running back, I would not mind James Robinson being my RB1 on this slate. I do worry about them being 10-point dogs on the road, but I still think he's a fine option. And if you don't, well, not really, if you don't want to go mid-range, just dropping down to the cheaper running backs, we have Myles Gaskin, who he's not activated off the IR yet, but it's kind of the assumption that he's going to. He's trending towards it. And with Matt Breida having COVID, and there's a couple of other injuries as well, and they don't even have Jordan Howard anymore, he should be in line for 20-plus touches, and it's a great matchup versus Cincinnati. They're double-digit home favorites, and Cincinnati's defense is nothing to be scared of. And the volume was consistent for him when he was the main guy, and I would assume that's going to be the case again. And he's getting targets every single game. If you're just looking at the past 4 games he actually played in, 4, 5, 4, and 6 targets. So he would definitely be in play for me. We're just going to have to make sure that he's activated off the IR first, obviously. Then after that, we have the two cheap running backs this week, as ugly as it sounds. So we have Devontae Booker at $5,500, and we have David Montgomery at $5,500. Both guys are in pretty good spots. Now, the matchup for David Montgomery is a bit better than Devontae Booker, But the Jets is not a defense that I'm really too scared of, but they've been a bit better versus the run, more so than the Detroit Lions. But we can certainly play both. I see a lot of people saying they're playing Booker over Montgomery, or they're playing Montgomery over Booker, but I don't see why you really can't play both this week. They're both way too cheap for the volume they're going to see, and it's also pretty good matchups for them. So I don't see why we can't play both, and I'm probably going to end up playing both in the first lineup that we are going to do. But anyway, enough talking about all of these guys. So let's just start building the lineup. So since we're doing a top dollar running back build to start off with, I'm going to go with Dalvin Cook. We're going to plug him in. He's just been having a fantastic season. I know he kind of busted last week. He still had over 20 touches and had 4 targets, and the work he's been getting in the passing game the past 3 weeks have been nice. But only 11.2 points last week, which is the worst game of the season. But you got to keep in mind, he got banged up in that game. He went into the medical tent. He ended up coming back. But overall, not a very solid day for Dalvin Cook. But he should be able to bounce back here versus Jacksonville. The Vikings have the highest implied team total in the slate this week. They're about 10-point favorites at home, which always sets up well for the home running back. He was upgraded to a full practice, yesterday. And he was practicing full, so he's going to be good to go for this one. We should see 20, 30 touches from him. And if that's going to be the case versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, you can sign me up for some Dalvin Cook. And there's plenty of value to fit him in this week, so I feel pretty good about just plugging him in, and we can build around Dalvin Cook in this lineup build. But since we're going top dollar here, we're probably going to have to spend down. So I think for this lineup, we just plug in David Montgomery and Devontae Booker here. So David Montgomery is actually coming off his best game of the season, where he had nearly 30 Draftkings points. It got over 100 yards rushing. Most of that came off of a 57-yard run because he only had 11 rushing attempts. But still, it was nice to see he had 6 targets, and he's pretty much the only running back in this offense since Tariq Cohen's went down. He's been seeing 80+% of the snaps, and it's a great matchup versus Detroit. They're one of the worst run defenses in football, and they're actually allowing the most DraftKings points per game to the position. So we should see around 20 touches for David Montgomery, maybe a little bit more. The 3-point favorites at home. I do think he's a very solid option here. We're going to plug him in as RB2, and then we're going to plug in Devontae Booker as our RB3 or flex spot. Now, if you're looking at the numbers this season, it's kind of a waste of time to do that because Josh Jacobs is the clear RB1 in that offense, but he got ruled out. Now, when I did my final thoughts video, I did not have Devontae Booker on there in addition to David Montgomery because I didn't have the news that Josh Jacobs was ruled out yet. But since he is ruled out, Devontae Booker is certainly a fine option here. The Jets have been better versus the run than they have versus the pass. They are dead last 32nd DVA versus the pass. Been better versus the run. But Booker is going to be RB1 here. He's also a capable pass catching running back as well. So the floor, I feel like he's pretty much the same exact play as David Montgomery. Just in maybe a slightly worse matchup, but they're about 8-9 point favorites. So it sets up well for the running back here. So Devontae Booker, we're going to plug him in at the flex. And I know it doesn't feel great having both David Montgomery and Devontae Booker in there because they're not the best running backs in the world, but the volume's going to be there. And I think they can pay off their $5,500 price tags. They're nice additions to Dalvin Cook. So with that being said, we can either start with the quarterback position now or the wide receiver position. And I think I'm just going to plug in a quarterback here because I kind of have in mind who I want to go with. And I know it's not for certain that he's starting yet, but assuming Ryan Fitzpatrick is the starting quarterback, we're not going to know until Sunday, but I feel like it's going to be Fitzpatrick here. At $6,000 versus Cincinnati, I know they're 11-point favorites at home, but I think he's just a nice, solid option to use this week. I know they're 11-point favorites at home, so that might not set up well game flow-wise for him, but he's always capable of turning the ball over and keeping the other team in the game. So at $6,000, it's just a good spot versus Cincinnati. I feel like he can get us 250, 300 yards and 2 to 3 touchdowns. And he also offers us a little bit of rushing upside as well. It's nothing too crazy, but he's certainly shown the ability to do that this season. So we're going to plug him in at $6,000. He's kind of right in that perfect price range where he's just kind of middle of the pack. If we have to go cheaper, there's Mitch Trubisky down there. There's Jared Goff, and there's a couple of other guys we can use as well. But assuming Ryan Fitzpatrick is the starter on Sunday, I think he's a great option versus Cincinnati. And since we have our quarterback in, we'll move on to the wide receiver position. There's a ton of good wide receivers to use this week. Now, Devontae Adams, he's not going to make this lineup. He's going to be in the next lineup because we're going to spend top dollar for a wide receiver in that one. But since I'm using Ryan Fitzpatrick, you can play him naked, but I want to pair him up with his wide receiver one. That's going to be Devontae Parker. I know his price came up a little bit from last week. I believe about, $500, $600. What was his price last week? Yeah, $1,500, so it went up $500. But he had 14 targets in that game, over 100 yards, 8 catches. Didn't get to the end zone with 22.9 DraftKings points, and I could see a similar game here versus Cincinnati. It was a great matchup versus the Jets last week. It's obviously a little bit tougher versus the Cincinnati Bengals, but they're not a defense that we should be scared of, and it just makes sense to pair him up with our quarterback in our lineup. So we're going to plug in Devontae Parker here in a good spot versus Cincinnati. And now at this point, we have $4,200 left per player. And normally I'd work on my wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 here, but there's an obvious tight end this week, and there's another guy I didn't have news on when I made my final thoughts video. So originally I said Jordan Akins was my favorite cheap tight end of the week at $2,900, which there's no Will Fuller anymore, so obviously he's going to be in line for some more targets. There's also a Randall Cobb. But we got the news that Jonnu Smith is going to be out for this game, meaning Anthony Firkser is going to be the main pass-catching tight end for the Tennessee Titans, and it's a great matchup versus the Cleveland Browns, who've been a pretty bad team versus tight ends all season long. So Anthony Firkser, he should see a handful of targets, probably anywhere from, I'd say, 4 to 7 targets in this game, and at $2,500, that is good enough for me. And he's had a couple of good games this season. He had 7.3 points versus the Baltimore Ravens, and I'll never forget that huge game he had week 6 versus the Houston Texans, where he had 9 targets, 8 catches, over 100 yards, got into the end zone, and nearly 30 DraftKings points. I think a lot of people played Jonnu Smith that week, and they were very upset about Anthony Firkser. So at $2,500, he's got upside. He's shown ability to have good games this season. So at $2,500, I mean, it's just really hard to pass him up. And he opens up your lineup too at $2,500. We now have nearly $5,000 left per player, and you got to keep in mind we also have a defensive spot opens, and we're probably gonna be around $3,000 for that. So let's just plug in some wide receivers as of right now. So we have our wide receiver 1 in Devontae Parker, and he just makes sense to pair up with Ryan Fitzpatrick. So we're going to work on wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. I feel like there's just 2 obvious options this week. So Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks. There's a lot of good mid-range wide receivers this week, but those are the guys that stand out the most to me. Now, we could obviously go with Cooper Kupp over Robert Woods, but I always say, since they're about the same price tag, I feel like they're the same plays every single week, so I'm going to side with the cheaper wide receiver, and that's going to be Robert Woods most weeks. He's only $5,900, and for the most part, he's having a pretty consistent season. He's also shown ability to have big games, and I mean, they're pretty much the same play, so I always like to go with the cheaper guy in Woods. He's got around a 22.5% target share this season compared to Cooper Kupp's 25% target share. Both have similar ADOTs, both getting close to the same amount of targets per game. It's a good matchup versus Arizona. I believe they're 22nd versus wide receivers this season, and I think all the Rams are too cheap. I do like the Goff, Kupp, Woods stack this week, and you can always run that back with someone on the Arizona Cardinals like Andy Isabella, Christian Kirk, or even DeAndre Hopkins, even though it's kind of a tough matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams. But I would not be surprised to see this game shoot out. But Robert Woods, the past 2 games, he's had 15 and 12 targets. He should get close to 10 targets in this game. And he's just fine for PPR, both him and Cooper Kupp, because I know they don't get the ball down the field too much, but for PPR scoring, they kind of rack up the catches and targets every single week. So I feel like he's a very safe play in cash games, and in my opinion, he's just a bit too cheap here. And then, like I already mentioned, Brandon Cooks at $5,600. I expect him to be one of, if not the highest owned player on the entire slate, because he's now the wide receiver 1 for Deshaun Watson, with Will Fuller being suspended. And Cooks was already pretty consistent this season. Now the targets have dropped the past 2 games to 5 targets apiece in week 11 and week 12, but before that, 8, 9, 9, 9, and 12 targets. So I'm expecting him to be pretty busy in this one. Also, Kiki Cutie should get a bump, and like I mentioned earlier, Jordan Akins as well. But at $5,600, I know it's a tough matchup versus the Colts. They're allowing the 6th fewest points per game to the wide receiver position, but it's mainly just a volume play. We know Brandon Cooks is talented, and he's got one of the best quarterbacks in football throwing the football, and he's also got a 51-point over-under in this game, so points are expected to be scored, and I think Cooks is the most likely guy to move the chains for the Houston Texans. So we're going to plug him in as our wide receiver 3. And at this point, we just have a defense left, and it's actually $3,100, which I think is around the Seahawks and Bears range, which are 2 of my favorite defenses to use this week. And yeah, the Bears are $3,100 going up against Detroit. It's actually a decent correlation play with David Montgomery, assuming the Bears hold the lead and they can just pound the rock with David Montgomery. So that kind of evens out our lineup, and I feel pretty good about that. We got Fitzpatrick at quarterback, Dalvin Cook as our stud of this lineup at $9,500, but it's a great matchup versus Jacksonville. Dave Montgomery in a great spot versus Detroit. I know I don't love Dave Montgomery as a football player. I don't think he's that great, but the matchup is good and the volume should be there, so it's good enough for me. Devontae Parker, it's a good spot versus Cincinnati, and we're just our pairing option with Ryan Fitzpatrick. Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks, 2 just cheap guys that should see around 10 targets, which is fine for me, and I just feel like they're both a little bit too cheap. Anthony Firkser with Jonnu Smith being out, he is just absolutely free, $2,500. Devontae Booker, kind of the same play as Dave Montgomery here with Josh Jacobs being out. Then the Bears defense, Detroit really doesn't scare me too much. Swift's kind of being eased in, and Kenny Galladay's going to be out again, so I'm not really too scared of their offense outside of maybe TJ Hawkinson and obviously DeAndre Swift. But I think the Bears defense are pretty solid. They're playing at home and they're 3-point favorites, so I think that makes sense. I think it's a nice solid build for spending up for running back. Then the next build here, we're going to spend down at the spend down at the running back position a little bit, and we'll spend up at the wide receiver spot. So let me clear this and we'll get into our next build. Alright, so since this is the spend-up wide receiver build, it's kind of obvious who we're going to use, but it's Davante Adams. He's at a massive price tag of $9,000, but if you're spending up for a wide receiver, he is definitely the guy to do it. He's been one of the most consistent rosters all season long, and what he's doing this season is pretty much what Michael Thomas did last year, where he doesn't really have bad games, and he's been almost as safe as some running backs this season, maybe even safer. But if you're looking at his game log, he's just been so good. I know it's boring to read through game logs, but still, 18, 26, 19, 36, 30, 47. Had a down game versus Tampa Bay, the Packers did overall. Then 6 points, he got hurt versus Detroit. Then week 1, 44.6 points. He pretty much scores a touchdown every single game. Besides the game he got hurt versus Detroit, in that game where the Packers overall were having a pretty down game versus Tampa Bay, he has scored every single time. 2 touchdowns, 2, 3, then 1 the past 4 weeks. And I know he had a down game versus Chicago. It's pretty good when your down game is 18.1 points, but his floor has been insanely high. Should see double-digit targets in this game. And I know the Philadelphia Eagles have kind of been mid-pack versus wide receivers, but I really have no concerns about Davante Adams no matter the matchup. And he should see a lot of Darius Slay if he happens to play. Darius Slay is currently questionable for this game, so if he happens to be out, I'm not really sure who's going to be able to stop Davante Adams here. And even if Darius Slay is in, I don't think he's going to be able to stop Davante Adams either. He was having a lot of trouble with DK Metcalf. Metcalf had nearly 200 receiving yards in that game. He was had over 100 yards really early on in that game. He beat him for like a 53-yard catch. I think that's what it was. So if they leave Slay one-on-one with Davante Adams, I'm pretty sure Davante Adams is going to win that matchup almost every single time here. And Rodgers has been playing absolutely phenomenal this season, and Adams is obviously the guy who's going to be looking to target the majority of this game. So I know he's expensive, but for this build, we're going to build around him, and we'll see if we can make it work. Now, to make it work, we're not going to be able to spend up for Dalvin Cook and feel too good about our lineup, so we're going to have to spend down a little bit. Now, I'm hoping we can fit in obviously the 2 cheap running backs, and Devontae Booker and David Montgomery, and maybe we can fit in a James Robinson, Aaron Jones, Austin Eckler kind of guy in our flex spot, because I'm not sure who it's going to be yet, but I know for sure I want to plug in the 2 5,500 backs, so we're going to put them in our RB1 and RB2 spot, and we're going to see what's available when we get to our flex position. So we're probably going to fill that out last, or maybe second to last, in addition to our defense. But Devontae Booker and David Montgomery, already talked about them, so I'm not going to waste my time or your time talking about them again. Just know they're in pretty good spots relative to their price tag with the volume that they're going to get. And now we could either work on the quarterback position, or we could start on wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3, or we could just plug in our tight end. The tight end's going to be obvious. It's Anthony Firkser, so I'll tell you that right now. So I feel like we can just plug him in at $2,500. He's free this week. It's hard to pass him up. I know Jordan Akins is there. I think he's a decent pivot off of Anthony Firkser. It was looking like Jordan Akins was going to be the chalk tight end, but that's obviously going to be Firkser now. But if you want to get different, Akins is the pivot now. And then we dropped 2 touchdowns last week, so people will have a sour taste in their mouth from playing Jordan Akins, especially me. So he should come in at some decent ownership with the news of the 2,500 tight end now. That completely opens up your lineup. So let's just start working on wide receivers, and we'll see what quarterback fits. It's probably going to be around that $6,000 range. So if we can fit in Fitzpatrick in, great. If we have to drop to a Goff, Derek Carr, someone like that, I think that's fine as well, or maybe even a Mitch Trubisky. But it's going to be the same wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 that we already used, because I just think they're in excellent spots this week. I'm having a hard time getting away from Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks as my wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 options, and we already talked about them, so we're just going to plug them in here. And we have $5,300 left per player, so we should be able to fit in, obviously, around a $3,000 defense. We should get, hopefully, like a $7,000 flex spot, which would be right where I want to get like a James Robinson or Austin Eckler in, or maybe even an Aaron Jones, although I'm not sure if I want to play Aaron Jones in addition to Davante Adams. Well, I guess we could, but let's see. So we can either start with the quarterback here or the flex. Well, let's go to the quarterback position and see if we can fit in Ryan Fitzpatrick here. And if we can, great. If not, that's fine. We'd have $5,000 left. So let's see if we can plug in the Bears defense once again, because that's kind of my favorite defense to use this week, or maybe even the Seahawks. So if we do that, we have $6,900 left, which would mean I'm not playing Alexander Madison, obviously. Justin Jefferson, I think, is a great player versus Jacksonville, but I don't think he's a cash play at around $7,000 this week, especially with Adam Thielen being back. Miles Sanderson's in a great spot versus Green Bay. Allen Robinson's in a great spot versus Detroit, but he is now questionable, so we're going to have to see what the news is on Allen Robinson. I'm assuming he plays, but it'd be unfortunate if he doesn't. But since we're just missing out on like Austin Eckler and James Robinson, let's drop down from Ryan Fitzpatrick a little bit, and maybe we can fit in a Jared Goff to get in. Goff's $200 more, which would mean we would be at $7,100, so we could fit in Austin Eckler if we do that. If I can find him really quick. Okay, so Jared Goff, I know he had an awful game last week, like absolutely awful game versus San Francisco 49ers. where he had 198 yards, no touchdowns, 2 picks, 52 quarterback rating, and 6.02 points. But the game before that, he did have 28 points. He's definitely not a guy that's easy to trust, but at $5,800, he's a little bit too cheap here, in my opinion. It's a good matchup versus Arizona. I know they're not the worst defense in the world, but they're not the greatest defense either, and I do think this game has some shootout potential. And he's just a nice pairing with Robert Woods, so it just makes sense in this lineup. And then we have $7,100 left, which means we could fit in Austin Eckler, who should see 20, 25 touches in this game. I can't assume he's going to get 16 targets every single week, but in 2 games, he's played with Justin Herbert, although I guess it's kind of 3 games. But he's had 2 games where he's had double-digit targets, so we know he's definitely going to be involved. He was not limited at all. He had 14 carries on the ground in addition to those 16 targets, so 30 opportunities there for Austin Eckler. That's probably more so on the ceiling side of things, but he should see at least something close to that, and that PPR upside for him is obviously something we definitely want in DraftKings, and it's a good spot versus New England, so I think that's a pretty good build too. So Jared Goff, Devontae Booker, David Montgomery, the 2 cheap running backs, with Devontae Adams, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, Ferkshire, the cheap free tight end, Austin Eckler is our RB1 technically, in the Bears defense. Now, if you want to find a way to fit in James Robinson over Austin Eckler, if you don't like Austin Eckler this week for some reason, we could just drop down the quarterback maybe a little bit. So if we plug in James Robinson, who's again one of my favorite plays on the slate as our RB1, we could drop down from Jared Goff and go the Mitch Trubisky route, which I'm not sure if I want to play Trubisky in addition to David Montgomery, but I guess it could work out because Montgomery does still get targets, and I think they could both have solid games. They're both way too cheap, in my opinion, a good matchup versus Detroit. And then we'd have $200 remaining, which means we could upgrade the defense a little bit if you want. So we could go with the Seahawks, or if you want to stay with the Bears defense, we could probably upgrade like a Robert Woods to Cooper Kupp. I know Cooper Kupp is $6,100. Now, personally, I do like Woods a little bit more than Kupp this week, but if you happen to like the Kupp route a little bit more, you could do that just to balance out your lineup. So I think that's pretty much it. So we kind of went through 3 builds there, but I hope this video was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. If we can get this out 1,000 subscribers this weekend, that would be absolutely awesome. I do appreciate each and every single one of you guys. If you want to follow me over on social media, the handle's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you want to support the channel over on Patreon, you can get access into the entire NFL DFS data sheet, which has a ton of information on there. Like pretty much every single thing you need heading into the weekend is $10 a month. You can hop into the Discord chat, cheat sheet, notes, all that fun stuff. It's all there if you are interested. And I think that's pretty much it. I'll have my core plays video out later this afternoon/evening, and I'll see you guys in the next one.